So David departed from there, referring to Gath, escaped to the cave of Adullam. His brothers, his father's house, heard of it, and they went down to him. The cave of Adullam is near a city at that time of that name. It was located in a kind of no man's land between Israel on the one hand and Philistia on the other, according to Josephus. It's now a location known as Eid el-Ma, I think it's pronounced, about 12 miles southeast of Bethlehem. It would have been a reasonable place to escape. It's outside the immediate jurisdiction of Saul and Israel, but it's also outside of any Philistine hill territory, so it is kind of a DMZ out there in the middle. The term Adullam means stronghold, and so sometimes you'll find the term used and it's translated stronghold, but the proper name of the place was rather descriptive of what it was like. It was rugged terrain. It was a good place to hide out. It was characterized by numerous small caves that kind of fit the description that we run into here, and so at least for the topography as we understand it today is certainly consistent with what's described here. It could easily accommodate some 400 people and probably many more, and they could all pretty much be obscure, hiding as it were in the Sherwood Forest there, and not so easily detected. David's family was of course feeling the heat. The fact that David himself had become Israel's most wanted man meant that the family of David was also exposed to something of the difficulties of the moment, and so they joined their embattled brother. And here now David, with this motley crew that has come with him into this place, pours out his lament to God. So the psalm that is most distinctively associated with this moment in David's life, Psalm 57, you might want to make a note of that. You might want to read it in its entirety later. But we certainly see a consistent expression of what he was going through at this point. It's entitled a mitkam, or a kind of poem of David when he fled from Saul into the cave. Just a couple of short sections from here. David cries out, "Be merciful to me, O God, be merciful to me. My soul trusts in you. In the shadow of your wings I will make my refuge until these calamities have passed by. I will cry out to God Most High, to God who performs all things for me. He shall send from heaven and save me. He reproaches the one who would swallow me up." So David feels the pressure of the moment, the threat of the circumstances. The psalm ends, however, on a rather stunning and triumphant note. "My heart is steadfast," David says, "O God, my heart is steadfast. I will sing and give praise. Awake my glory, awake lute and harp. I'll awaken the dawn. I will praise you, O Lord, among the peoples. I will sing to you among the nations. For your mercy reaches unto the heavens, and your truth into the clouds. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be above all the earth." And if you read it carefully, you'll notice this kind of evolving perspective of, as David puts pen to paper, as it were, and expresses this, you feel all of the trauma at the beginning, but by the end of it, of course, filled with great confidence. It's good for us to write sometimes our feelings and our thoughts, and you'll find that even the exercise of doing that can sometimes solidify our understanding of God's care and God's work in our lives. Well, these interesting folks begin to join him, people in distress, in debt, discontented, so that he became the captain over a probably rather interesting bunch of people. I can imagine that it was a bit of a management challenge for David, to deal with these folks. It's commonly thought that Saul probably had let the humane laws that Moses had put in place related to indentured servitude, slavery, indebtedness, usury, had let those kind of deteriorate. Moses put rules in place that were light years ahead of any surrounding culture of the day in his time. And even in the time of Saul, hundreds of years later, it was still a very enlightened understanding of how debt and usury and so on should be handled. But Saul, of course, was preoccupied with other things, and what happens is that people get into hard times financially and otherwise, and some of these, trying to escape the ravages of those circumstances, find their way to David. David goes to Mizpah in Moab, saying to the king of Moab, "Let my father and mother come here to you until I know what God's going to do for me." So he brought them before the king, and they dwelt there, the parents did, in Moab, while David was in the stronghold. Moab is way down on the southeast side of the Dead Sea, so it actually has a pretty significant insulation, you might say, from attack from Israel or from Saul, although they did get in skirmishes from time to time. And so David feels fairly safe in leaving his parents there. I'm sure he played the card with the king of Moab by reminding him that his great-grandmother was a full-blooded Moabite woman, Ruth, who married Boaz after she immigrated to Israel with her beloved mother-in-law Naomi, both of them widows. Ruth wound up marrying Boaz, and they had Obed. Obed and his wife had Jesse. Jesse and his wife had David. And so there is a family connection there, and I imagine that David reminded the king of that. He might have also mentioned to the king of Moab that only recently he and the king of Israel had been in war with each other, and so there was not a lot of goodwill between them at the moment. So for whatever reasons, the king of Moab seems quite happy to accommodate this request, and so we know that at least for a time, mom and dad are out of harm's way. The prophet Gad said to David, "Don't stay in the stronghold, depart and go to the land of Judah." So David departed and went into the forest of Hereth. Gad is a fellow who appears to have been trained maybe at the time of, or maybe sometime later than David, at the school that was run by Samuel. The fact that Samuel apparently sent Gad, who had been trained in the school of the prophets, to join himself and be an assistant to David suggests that the school of the prophets generally was at this point aligned with David, and that they were in fact doing all they could to support him in the difficulties that he was facing. Gad himself is mentioned quite a few times in the history of David. He became David's so-called seer. A seer was one who was able to use what is called Hebrew oracle, which is somewhat mysterious in the Old Testament, is commonly associated with what's called the ephod, which had the Urim and the Thummim, And by that means, there was a way of accessing, usually on the basis of a yes or no type question, the mind of God with respect to a particular issue. When it says in David's life that he inquired of the Lord, it's commonly understood that that's what that means. He inquired of the Hebrew oracle of some kind of situation that was arising, and Gad became, at least for a time, the principal individual by whom that particular inquiry could be made. Gad was also, however, a critic of David on occasion. When David went out and did an unauthorized census of the people, Gad pointed that out and let him know that that was a little bit out of line. Gad is said in 1 Chronicles to have written a history of David's life. We assume that at least some of that made its way into the final edition of the stories of David that we have in the Old Testament, and so we may be reading something of what Gad himself wrote as we go through 1 and 2 Samuel, and as you read also 1 and 2 Chronicles. Well, Gad says to David that he should return to the land of Judah. He was in Deulim, as I say, that was outside the city limits, as it were, of Israel. But Gad tells him to go back into Israel, but go to the region of his own tribe, partly because his tribe will be most sympathetic to him, presumably, partly because it gives David an opportunity to engage in a defensive, protective function for these occasional Philistine raiding attacks that would take place. And so that's what David does. So he goes to a place that's called Hereth. If you can see that on the map, that little circled area is called the Forest of Hereth. Not far from Adullam, in fact only about 3 miles, but across the border now back into Judah. When Saul heard that David and the men who were with him had been discovered, Now Saul was staying at Gibeah under a tamarisk tree in Ramah with his spear in his hand and all his servants standing around him, kind of a suspended sentence there. This is not the Ramah where Samuel ran his school. There was another one that was in the tribal region of Benjamin in Gibeah, and so that's where he is. He's in the tribe that he belongs to himself. This is where he's going to have the greatest support. Other tribes are becoming pretty disenfranchised with Saul, as he deteriorates, but at least at this point, his own tribe seems to be standing with him. It appears, because they're all standing, that this is some kind of formal gathering that's taking place, and Saul is suspicious that there's a double agent among these who are supposed to be his closest and most loyal supporters. And so he is in effect calling them on the carpet here to figure out who is it that has been failing to give Saul good intel about what's happening with David. Who is it that hasn't told him of the deal between Jonathan and David? Who is it that's not providing him the necessary information he needs to capture this public enemy? And so you get the feeling of the accusation that he brings here. Saul said to his servants who stood around him, "Now listen here, you Benjamites. Will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards and make you all captains of thousands and captains of hundreds? All of you have conspired against me. There's no one who reveals to me that my son has made a covenant with the son of Jesse. There's not one of you who's feeling sorry for me or reveals to me that my own son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as it was this day." This is a poor me speech if I ever heard one, you see, coming from Saul, and he's blaming these Benjamites, these people that are supposed to be his most loyal supporters, are the ones that he's accusing. Notice he appeals purely to selfish motives. Do you think David's going to do all the special favoritism that I've done for you, giving you all these, allowances and inside benefits and that kind of thing? Do you think that David's going to be, treating you this well? And you can see that he's trying to reach them basically on the foundation of their own selfish interests. No one has told him about this covenant. Somehow Saul knew about it, that Jonathan and David had made earlier. He reveals again what we'd call a kind of paranoia. They're all lying in wait for them. They're all looking for an opportunity to do him in. And this is the point where this character Doeg that we met last week shows up. He'd been set over the servants of Saul, and he said, "I saw the son of Jesse going to Nob, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, and inquired of the Lord for him, and gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath, the Philistine." We met Doeg last week. He was there. The phrase that's used of him is he was detained. And it's rather ambiguous what that means, but we do get an impression that certainly seems to explain what happens here, that there was a kind of hostility or animosity between Doeg and the priests. Apparently the priest had found something in Doeg, who was a foreigner, who was an Edomite, and yet was a close associate of Saul, something that required that he go through some kind of detention, not jail exactly, but some kind of procedure there with the priests. And Doeg apparently didn't like it much and was looking for some excuse to get back at them, which he actually does in a big way. David was a little concerned about it. We'll learn that today, because he saw Doeg, that kind of dark foreigner, not really aligned with the religion of Israel, close associate of Saul. David had all his feelers out there and realized this may not be a good situation, but what can he do? He's trying to protect Ahimelech, so he doesn't want to tell too much, but he has to say enough to get some provisions for the journey. It put David in a kind of awkward position. And now Doeg, of course, just as David feared, steps up and begins to focus, notice, suspicion now not on the associates of Saul in Benjamin, but on those lousy priests who apparently had given Doeg some grief earlier. He embellishes the story considerably. David, of course, would never have invoked the Hebrew oracle at this point, because that would fully disclose what David was up to, and he was trying to keep Ahimelech in a position of at least, defensible ignorance. And so this is a story that goes a little beyond what actually happened, but it works. Saul takes the bait. So the king sent to call Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's house, the priests who were in Nob. And they all came to the king, and Saul said, "Okay, listen here, son of Ahitub." And he answered, "Here I am, my lord." Then Saul said to him, "Why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, and that you've given him bread and a sword and inquired of God for him, that he should rise up against me and lie in wait against me as it is this day?" So Saul believes everything that Doeg has kind of implied, and even takes it a step farther and assumes that this must be some broad-based conspiracy, that all of these priests have been huddling together some way, you see, to stand against Saul. And of course, nothing of the sort was happening. David was doing everything he could to prevent these guys from being in any way knowingly complicit in David's need to escape. But Doeg, apparently for his own agenda, is kind of peddling this particular idea, and Saul seems to be buying it. Well, Ahimelech speaks not only in the defense of himself, but in the defense of David. So Ahimelech answered the king and said, "Who among all your servants is as faithful as David, who is the king's son-in-law, who goes at your bidding, who is honorable in your house? And did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Far be it from me. Let not the king impute anything to his servant in any of the house of my father. For your servant knew nothing of this, little or much." Plausible deniability, and that's exactly what David gave him, and that's what he invokes, that he didn't know what was going on. Even if he suspected something, he didn't know for sure, and certainly couldn't have been held to account for that. Well, the king said, "You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's house." The appeal, I suppose, by Ahimelech was to hopefully soften the heart of Saul toward David, to get Saul thinking better things about him, but that praise only embittered Saul, apparently. The reference to going at your bidding is a phrase that would suggest he's part of your inner circle, he's one of your trusted servants. He is on the inside, as it were, and goes at your immediate command, not working through intermediaries, that sort of thing. The business about inquiring of God, the Hebrew oracle, Ahimelech denies it, and rightly so, because it's highly improbable that David would have asked him to do that. But as I say, Doeg apparently is carrying out his own grudge against these in a big way, and it certainly turns out to be just what he was hoping for. So the king said to the guards who stood about him, "Turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew when he fled and did not tell it to me." But the servants of the king would not lift their hands to strike the priests of the Lord. And the king said to Doeg, "Okay, you turn and kill the priests." So Doeg the Edomite turned and struck the priests, and killed on that day 85 men who wore a linen ephod. Also Nob, the city of the priests, he struck with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and nursing infants, oxen and donkeys and sheep, with the edge of the sword. So the man was vicious, and he was able to realize everything that he had hoped for. Apparently, he had some working with him to wipe out a whole city, but all of that takes place basically with the blessing here of Saul. The guards of Saul, his personal bodyguards, were unwilling, for obvious reasons, to raise their hands against characters that were viewed as holy men and men who should not be harmed, and even the command of the king wasn't capable of moving them across that line. But Doeg was quite happy to do it. 85 men died. We'd say it was not only an outrageous evil, but it reflected boundless stupidity on the part of Saul at this point, because if there was any trace of goodwill that he still had left with the people of Israel, this pretty much did him in, you see. That to commit an atrocity like this would be almost unthinkable at that day and time, or at any day and time. And so that seems to be the case. As we mentioned last week, some commentators believe, however, that this atrocity, which on the face of it, of course, was a great evil, was nevertheless a full realization of a judgment that had been pronounced against the house of Eli some generations earlier, We hear in the Old Testament that the sins of the fathers are visited on the children to the third and fourth generation. And it does appear that this is an expression of that. Whatever your thoughts are on that, I'm not going to explore it further, but just to know that that has at least been an observation made concerning this particular incident, and we'll just leave it at that. One commentator says of this, Saul has broken with Samuel and quarreled with David. Now his evil genius leads him to a final disastrous act of injustice by which he loses the support of the priests. From this point, it is a short step to his downfall. And we'll begin to see that story unfolding soon enough. One of the sons of Ahimelech, apparently the only surviving son, was named Abiathar. He escaped and fled after David. And Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the Lord's priests. So David said to Abiathar, I knew that day, when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul, I have caused the death of all the persons of your father's house. Stay with me, don't fear. He who seeks my life seeks your life, but with me you will be safe. Abiathar turned out to be the main priestly character for some time in David's life. He was the son of Ahimelech. He served David all his life. Another priest, Zadok, became the primary high priest, but Abiathar was always there. The only negative we really have concerning him, which may carry out the rest of that House of Eli problem, was that at the end of his life, Abiathar unwisely sided against Solomon. David had appointed Solomon to be his successor in David's old age. We'll see that eventually. Abiathar stood with Adonijah, who was kind of a usurping brother trying to take the throne. And for that, Solomon didn't execute him, but did banish him. And so we see even in the case of Abiathar, ultimately a little of that judgment is carried out. So David, of course, owns responsibility for here. I think we have to say there's not much David could have done. He had no way of knowing Doeg was there in the first place, and arriving, he certainly did what he could to try to protect Ahimelech, but he had grave suspicions, I suppose, throughout, and though he was not culpable exactly, he certainly feels responsible for what's taken place. He gives promises to Abiathar. The idiom we would probably use for David's statement, with me you will be safe, is Saul will have to get to you over my dead body. You know, that's that kind of thing, and I think that certainly turned out to be the case. Well, chapter 23 we're going to skip over for the most part. I want to give you at least the feel for the chapter, and if you read it this past week, then you will be familiar with this. David is now back in the region of Judah, barely across the border. He's not far from a city called Keilah. This city was rescued by David against a Philistine raiding party. He drove them off, and of course you would think on the face of it that would make the folks of Keilah quite appreciative. Well, this is the first time we hear of David actually consulting the Hebrew oracle, which tells him that these folks in Keilah are, notwithstanding the heroics David has performed for them, they are not to be trusted. And so David, taking that advice, moves a little south to a town called Ziph. It's here that, as David is in the outskirts of Ziph, kind of out in the wooded area around it, that we have the last occasion we know of in which Jonathan and David meet. And these verses, I think, are worth a quick review. Then Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David in the woods, and strengthened his hand in God. And he said to him, do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You will be king over Israel, and I will stand next to you. Even my father Saul knows that. So the two of them made a covenant before the Lord. David stayed in the woods. Jonathan went to his own house. And so once again we have this, the last of these occasions when the two men make a commitment to one another. Jonathan, of course, doesn't know the way the story will play out. He's hopefully believing that he can be beside David as his prime minister and have that kind of position. And if he had survived, he certainly would have probably been in a very high position in David's administration. But of course, as you probably know, Saul and Jonathan both died at the hands of the Philistines on Mount Gilboa, and so eventually we'll see that as well. Well, as it turns out, Ziph also betrays David's whereabouts to Saul, and David probably would have been in a heap of trouble here, except that as Saul is attacking with a goodly force, he hears that the Philistines have once again invaded, and Saul has to go off and resist that invasion, and so David once again escapes from the noose. And this brings us to chapter 24. Now it happened when Saul had returned from following the Philistines, the end of that skirmish, that it was told him, saying, "Look, David is in the wilderness of En Gedi." En Gedi is currently called En Gedi, I think, or something like that, on the shore of the Dead Sea. So it's over a little east of where he has been. The terrain to get to this region is very rugged. These stone steps did not exist in the day of David's stay there, and they had to kind of fight their way in using machetes to get to this particular area, but it was fairly safe apparently once they were there. The area itself is known to be quite lush, both today and back in the days of David. This little waterfall is actually called David's Waterfall. I don't know if it was there in David's day or not, but nevertheless it's kind of a lovely place, but difficult to get to. Saul, nevertheless, learned of it, took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel, and went to seek David and his men on the rocks of the wild goats. So he chose some crack troops. The rocks of the wild goats, these critters are fairly common there, and they were in that day as well. He came to what's called the sheepfolds by the road, and there was a cave. And Saul went in to attend to his needs. And David and his men were staying in the recesses of the cave. The word here is actually something more like sheep coats. This was a peculiar kind of terrain in which you'd have a cave that had a little protective barricade outside, kind of forming a semicircular barrier. It's called a sheep coat, because shepherds would customarily use it at night. If it was very cold, the sheep could go inside the cave where it was a little bit warmer. The shepherd would typically sleep outside to protect the sheep from any wild animals, that sort of thing. And so it was a common kind of thing. There were several of them around, and that seems to be where these things took place. This is where Saul, of course, went in private to take care of some personal demands of nature, I assume, and this is when this interesting story plays out. Then the men of David said to him, "This is the day. This is it. The Lord said it to you. Behold, I'll deliver your enemy into your hand, that you may do to him as seems good to you." And David arose, thinking about it, and secretly cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Now it happened afterward that David's heart troubled him because he had cut Saul's robe. Well, the men who are with David saw what was clearly providence, but misinterpreted it in a fairly breathtaking way, believing that the promise made to David that he would someday be the king translated into a justification to put a knife in a back right here and right now. David was troubled because he cut a little piece off the robe, not to mention putting a knife in the back, you see. So you can tell where David's conscience was in this regard. One commentator quipped on this: if he were working for a company, he would be troubled that he took a pen or a paper clip from his employer, you know. There are people like that, and there are people that are not like that, as you're well aware. And having been an employer at times in my life, I've had both working for me, to be honest with you. But, you know, this is a Christian conscience. A Christian conscience is wide awake to what we do and what it means. And here we have David really reflecting something of that. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, to the Lord's anointed, and stretch out my hand against him, seeing that he is the anointed of the Lord." So David restrained his servants with these words and did not allow them to rise against Saul. And Saul got up from the cave and went on his way. So David here is showing respect for Saul, not because Saul is especially respectable, but because he does have that anointing. He has something of God's sanction upon him. We learn from the Apostle Paul in the New Testament that the powers that be are ordained by God. That is no vindication of the integrity or the virtue of any particular person who has that power. Power can be used and power can be abused, and we're all very much aware of that. But if it's power that comes from God, it still deserves respect because of its connections to God, regardless of the particulars of the virtue being displayed in any given moment. And certainly David gives us a good example of that attitude in the way that he responds to Saul. One said, in spite of the abuse, David still holds Saul in awe as the Lord's anointed. He even feels guilty for cutting the hem of his robe. David gives a good model of reverence for rulers, even when they are truly misguided, because their authority is still from God. The classic text, of course, in the Bible that delineates that is Romans chapter 13, the Apostle Paul, who gives us that kind of description of the way in which Christian people are to respond to authority. And here David, of course, in the Old Testament, carries out very much a similar point of view. So David restrained his servants. The word that's used there for restraining is a word that's quite strong, and it would suggest that David had to invoke every ounce of authority that he had to prevent any of his men from going down and doing the job that David himself had been unwilling to do. David arose afterward, went out of the cave, and called out to Saul, saying, "My lord the king." When Saul looked behind him, David stooped with his face to the earth and bowed down. So Saul is leaving this cave, apparently alone at the moment. He doesn't have his bodyguard with him, doesn't know that he's in any peril. David, of course, in order to dramatize that he is no rebel, bows down. That's the customary ancient Near Eastern view of showing deep respect. And at this point, he's trying to communicate something that he has tried to communicate many times before. At this point, David gives a remarkable speech, appealing to Saul. "Why do you listen to the words of men who say to you, 'Indeed, David seeks your harm'? Look, this day your eyes have seen that the Lord delivered you today into my hand in the cave. And someone urged me to kill you, but my eyes spared you, and I said, I will not stretch out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed." We see the politic genius of David. The first thing he does, in effect, is say, "Now look, Saul, I know this isn't you. You're a better man than this. You're just getting some bad advice. Who are those idiots who are telling you that I'm out to get you?" So, it's like David wants to give Saul an out. "Well, David, I didn't know that. Well, I appreciate that, son, And so David, right off the bat, is using that kind of strategy, trying to give Saul some excuse for the way that he's been behaving. This particular line is remarkable, and it's been commented on by more than one who've looked at this text and read it in terms of what it actually says in Hebrew. The phrase would be something like this, translated just straight up. "Yahweh delivered you today into my hand and told me to kill you." See. Now, it's never translated that way because it just doesn't seem to be the intended meaning. But there is a kind of sense in which that's the way it should be read. It's not that God was commanding David at this point to kill Saul, but it was certainly the impression one would get from the providential moment. What were the chances in a region that was filled with all kinds of caves and little hideouts and so on, that Saul would just happen to walk into the cave where David and his men were hiding? They didn't ask for this. They didn't put up a big sign saying, men's room this way, or they didn't do anything like that. They didn't give some kind of, appeal. They were just hiding. They just didn't want to be found. And here comes the king walking into that very cave. You can see where, if you were David or if you were one of the men with him, you would say, wow, this has got to be providence, doesn't it? This has got to be God bringing Saul right into your power, into your grip. This is your chance. I mean, who can deny this is the message here? You know. It is a fact from a Christian's perspective on life based on faith that God is a God of providence. It's always a fact that we are in jeopardy of over-interpreting providence, of drawing from it meanings that are not legitimate. And that was the difference between David and his men at this point. He saw the providential occasion, certainly, that Saul just happened to walk into that cave. But he also realized that that in itself did not become some kind of mandate to take action against Saul, even though the appearance of providence seemed to suggest it, you see. And so the language of the text is so bold as to actually say Yahweh told me to do it, but I think the sense is Yahweh was appearing to tell me to do it in terms of the providential moment, but not that God actually spoke to him somehow in an audible way and said, go kill Saul or anything like that. So that's David's first point, David's first appeal to Saul. Then he goes on and gives the following. Moreover, my father, look, yes, it's the corner of your robe. You can just imagine Saul looking, there, it's gone, you know, the corner of his robe. For in that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you. Know and see that there is neither evil nor rebellion in my hand. I have not sinned against you, yet you hunt my life to take it. Let the Lord judge between you and me, and let the Lord avenge me on you, but my hand will not be against you. As the proverb of the ancients says, wickedness proceeds from the wicked, but my hand shall not be against you. Notice all the levels to which David appeals to Saul. First of all, an appeal to family. He appeals to him as his father. He is his father. He's his father-in-law. He's married to Michal, his daughter. David certainly means more than that. He views him as a father in Israel, a father in the form of a king, all of that. He then appeals to justice. He reflects the biblical ethic we all are familiar with. Do not avenge yourselves. We are prohibited as God's people from taking vengeance on our own behalf against ourselves. There's a lot more to be said on that point, but I think you understand the fundamental principle that the practice of just getting even is forbidden to us. We are told, commanded to give place to God's wrath. God is more concerned about avenging your interests than you are. And I can be pretty concerned about my interests, believe me, but God is a God of justice. And so the tactic of faith is to trust that God sees and will, in his perfect way, do such a thing. David appeals to wisdom. This proverb of the ancients, rendered here, wickedness proceeds from the wicked, the sense of it is this: the wicked will inevitably do wickedly when opportunity arises, regardless of how much they hypocritically protest their innocence. It's easy to try to project innocence, but the proverb stood for the idea that when the right opportunity comes, a wicked motive will do a wicked thing, that the hypocrisy will fade away, and the true interest of the moment will be expressed. And so David is saying, hey, this was my chance. If I were such a wicked man, you'd still be laying there a dead corpse in the cave. But there is no wickedness here. So the appeal to Saul on that basis. The next appeal is in the next couple of verses. After whom has the king of Israel come out? Whom do you pursue? A dead dog, a flea? Therefore let the Lord be judge, and judge between you and me, and see and plead my case, and deliver me out of your hand. The last is an appeal to reason. You bring 3,000 crack troops out here into the forest to swat a fly? Come on, get a grip. You see, David is, and you can see all of this is just an amazing kind of artistic attempt to reach whatever semblance of sanity may still be hiding in that man. Well, David ultimately concludes by indicating he's leaving this in the hands of God. It's a moving speech. It shows David's heart. It shows his affection, his respect, his faith. It shows a lot of good things about him. He's not always so good, but this is one of his better moments for sure. And it certainly reached the heart of Saul. So it was, when David had finished speaking these words to Saul, that Saul said, "Is that your voice, my son, David?" And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. What a scene. One said, the speech of David has so much natural eloquence, such warmth and persuasiveness, that it can be read by no one who has any feeling for the simple beauties of the Bible without emotion. We see David standing on the summit of some rock in the wilderness, raising on high the trophy of his magnanimity, while addressing the melancholy Saul, whom he loved as a father, obeyed as a king, honored as the Lord's anointed, but who nevertheless hated him without reason and followed him with unremitting energy to put him to death. The contrast here is one of the most remarkable, I think, in all of human history and all of human literature. Jesus said, love your enemies. And David is wonderful in the, at least, point that here he certainly gives us a remarkable, really astonishing display of such an attitude. Well, at least for the moment, Saul was touched. He said to David, you are more righteous than I. You've rewarded me with good, whereas I have rewarded you with evil. You've shown this day how you have dealt well with me, for when the Lord delivered me into your hand, you didn't kill me. If a man finds his enemy, will he let him get away safely? Therefore, may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done for me this day. The language here technically is actually the language you would ordinarily find in a courtroom. Saul is a judge. That's part of the kingly role, and he's using courtroom language. You are more righteous. It really reflects a verdict of not guilty in a courtroom setting. You have shown, the word that's used here is actually normally translated testified. You have testified, which is to say offered this irrefutable evidence of your innocence. And interestingly, Saul actually winds up in effect praying for David's well-being, the man who only moments before he was breathing out his hatred. But now, even more remarkably, Saul takes the next step in this adjudication. And now I know indeed that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hand. Therefore, swear to me now by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants after me, and that you will not destroy my name from my father's house. So David swore to Saul. And Saul went home, but David and his men went back to the stronghold. Saul, of course, knew it because Samuel had told him this some years earlier. There was an interesting kind of parallel incident that you may recall when Saul had been disobedient to an express command given to him by Samuel, and Samuel said to him, the kingdom is taken from you. And Saul reached out and grabbed Samuel's coat and ripped it, and was holding a piece of it in his hand. And Samuel turned around and said to Saul, just as you ripped my coat, God is ripping from you the kingdom because of your disobedience. I have a feeling now that when Saul was standing there looking at a little piece of his own robe in the hand of David, that probably came flashing back in his mind and probably reaffirmed what Samuel had actually said to him so many years earlier. Jonathan had required of David that he promise he would not do what was so common in the ancient Near East, get rid of the prior dynastic house, all of its members, wipe them out, when he became the king. Now Saul does the same thing. So at least at this point, so fervently does he see it, that he's actually requesting, oddly enough, ironically enough, protection from David in the face of what appears to be the irresistible destiny for David. Well, David goes back to his stronghold. He's got an improved position, but he's not under any illusions. He's not going to just grab on and go back to town, with Saul. So we leave the story there. Next week, we're going to be covering only chapter 25, just one chapter this week to read. We're going to slow down just a bit for that fascinating and very enjoyable chapter. Sunday school lesson this morning is back to this idea of providence. Providence has been defined, the conviction that the most minute details of life are ordained by God to bring about His purpose to do good for His people. If you're a genuine Christian person and see life through the eyes of faith, then there's not a day goes by that you don't have a sense of providence at work in your life, even when you miss a red light or something. Even the details of life. There comes to be a point when we see the hand of God, the fingerprints of God, and sometimes some of the most innocuous little details. And Christian people can sound a little odd to their unbelieving friends if they start talking about that, because it seems like you're seeing the universe in a very strange way, but that's part of it. That in itself, I think, is kind of a given for a genuine Christian person, but it can be distorted in one of two ways. One is just simply to be blind to it, to think that life is just mostly random, and God is sort of out there like the deist thought, kind of, distantly interested, but not really able to do much about it, That's not really a Christian attitude. The other, however, is to begin to become so fixated on the little details of life that we begin to think we're hearing messages through them, do this, do that, as if somehow we're, as I said earlier, over-interpreting providence and not staying closer to the Word of God than the way we interpret the various details in life. David here gives us, I think, 3 good examples of how to respond to what is apparently providential. First, he relied on providence by going to the king of Moab. He believed that God had arranged the circumstances of life, this man with whom he may have been a distant relative, such that he was justified in entrusting the care of his parents into the hands of the king of Moab, and that was his, I think, reliance on what he saw as the providential aspects of his moment. David, however, questioned the appearance of providence when he was there in the forest of Hereth and the towns Keilah and Ziph. He would have thought, having rescued the folks in Keilah, that would suggest that they'd be, up for protecting him, that they'd be willing to give him some kind of care and so on, cover. But he's not so sure about it. And on that occasion, we hear that he actually inquired of the Lord, questioning providence, not just taking it for granted. The most dramatic example, of course, is when he repudiated the appearance of providence. Certainly it was providential that Saul walked into that cave, but the meaning of the providence, that he should therefore put a knife in the back of Saul, was what David was not prepared to embrace. Even though it looked that way, David knew better. And that's the warning I think we all have. We can see the hand of providence all around us, but we need to be kind of careful never to leap to a conclusion as to what it means. We always have to test our thoughts, our plans, our motives against God's Word, not against what we may think is going on in God's providential work around us. So, hope that helps. That brings us to 1 Samuel 25. We'll take a look at that next week.